Robert Keller pulled his black sedan into the cemetery's curved driveway, the same way he had done on the 15th of every month for the past 5 years. The security guard at the entrance nodded in recognition as Robert drove past. By now, they needed no words. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-kept grounds. Robert parked in his usual spot under the old oak tree and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the bouquet of blue hydrangeas on the passenger seat, Alex's favorite. Even after 5 years, the pain felt fresh, a wound that refused to heal. Robert stepped out of the car, straightening his tie more out of habit than necessity. At 53, he still cut an impressive figure, tall, with salt and pepper hair, and the confident posture that came from 2 decades leading one of the country's largest software companies. But here, among the headstones, titles and achievements meant nothing. He walked the familiar path, gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet cemetery, where even the birds seemed to sing in hushed tones out of respect. As he approached Alex's grave, Robert noticed something unusual. A small figure sitting on the ground near the row where his son was buried. Robert slowed his pace. In all his visits, he'd rarely encountered another person in this section of the cemetery, especially not on a Thursday afternoon. Most people came on weekends or holidays. He preferred the solitude of weekdays. The figure was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, sitting cross-legged in front of a headstone about 4 plots away from Alex's. The boy wore jeans and a blue t-shirt that had seen better days. His head was bent forward, seemingly in conversation with the grave before him. Robert hesitated, then continued toward his son's resting place, keeping his eyes fixed ahead. He didn't want to intrude on whatever private moment the boy was having, just as he wouldn't want someone intruding on his. At Alex's grave, Robert knelt down and gently placed the flowers in the built-in vase. The headstone was simple yet elegant, polished granite with Alex's full name, Alexander James Keller, the dates of his birth and death, and the words, "Beloved son, forever in our hearts." Robert had agonized over those words, finding everything he wrote inadequate to capture who Alex had been. "Hey, buddy," Robert whispered, running his fingers over the engraved letters of his son's name. "I brought your favorites." He settled onto the small bench he'd had installed beside the grave. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery, a ritual as important as the flowers. He scrolled to the album labeled simply Alex and began his silent sharing of the past month. There was a time when Robert's wife, Diane, had joined him for these visits. In the first year after the accident, they'd come together, leaning on each other through waves of grief. But as months turned into years, their ways of mourning grew different, incompatible. Diane had joined a support group, started volunteering with a children's charity, finding ways to move forward while keeping Alex's memory alive. Robert, however, couldn't seem to find that balance. He'd thrown himself back into work within weeks of the funeral, staying late at the office, traveling more than necessary, filling every moment with activity to avoid the silence of their too-empty house. These monthly visits remained his only, deliberate acknowledgement of his loss. The Palmer deal finally went through, Robert said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You would have liked the technical challenges on this one. Their entire infrastructure needed rebuilding from the ground up." He continued talking, telling Alex about the company's newest projects, a book he'd read, and the hiking trail he'd discovered last weekend. What he didn't mention was the growing distance between him and Diane, or how their home had become little more than a place where they occasionally crossed paths between their busy schedules. Robert was explaining the concept behind a new app his company was developing when he sensed movement in his peripheral vision. The boy had stood up and was brushing dirt from his jeans. As if feeling Robert's gaze, the boy looked over. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance. The boy gave a small, solemn nod, a gesture that seemed strangely adult, before turning away. Something about that nod, that moment of shared understanding in this place of loss, caught Robert off guard. Children Alex's age had always been difficult for him to see after the accident. each one a painful reminder of the growing up his son would never do. Alex would have been 15 now, old enough to be learning to drive. Robert could imagine the arguments they might have had over screen time, curfews, or the usual teenage rebellion. He would have welcomed those arguments, those ordinary parental frustrations, over this hollow ache of absence. The boy was walking away now, following the path that led toward the cemetery's eastern gate. He moved with a slight shuffle, hands in his pockets, head down. Something about his solitary figure stirred something in Robert. Recognition, perhaps. The boy was alone here, just as he was. Robert turned back to Alex's grave, suddenly finding it harder to continue his one-sided conversation. The spell had been broken. He sat in silence for several minutes, watching the way the late afternoon light played across the polished surface of the headstone. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Conference call with Tokyo moved to 8 p.m. Documents in your email. The outside world intruding as it always did. I should go, Robert said to the grave. I'll be back next month. I miss you, Alex. Every day. He stood, legs stiff from sitting on the hard bench. Before leaving, he adjusted the hydrangeas in their face and brushed a few fallen leaves from the top of the headstone. As he walked back to his car, Robert found himself glancing toward the grave the boy had been visiting. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged anymore, prompted him to take a small detour. The headstone was smaller than Alex's, though well-maintained. Lisa Marie Taylor, it read, with dates suggesting she died in her mid-30s just 3 years ago. Below her name were the words, loving mother, daughter, and friend. Mother. The boy had been visiting his mother's grave. The realization hit Robert with unexpected force. He knew that particular loss too well, but from the other side of the equation. Back in his car, Robert sat with the engine off, watching as the shadows lengthened across the cemetery grounds. The boy was nowhere to be seen now. Robert wondered where he lived, who was raising him, what his life was like without his mother. For the first time in years, Robert found himself thinking about someone else's pain, instead of just his own. He started the car and pulled out of the parking spot, driving slowly past the rows of headstones. At the cemetery gate, he nodded to the security guard and turned onto the main road. The dashboard clock read 5:27 p.m. If traffic was light, he could make it to the office for that 8 p.m. call with Tokyo. But instead of taking his usual route toward the highway, Robert found himself turning toward home. The Tokyo team could handle the call without him. Tonight he wanted to be in the house he and Diane had once filled with laughter, the home they had created for Alex. Maybe Diane would be there. Maybe they could order takeout and sit at the dining table instead of eating separately in different rooms. Maybe they could talk, really talk, for the first time in months. As he drove, Robert found himself thinking again about the boy at the cemetery. There had been something in that brief exchange of glances, that simple nod between strangers united by loss, that had shifted something inside him, a tiny crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Robert didn't believe in signs or fate or any of the spiritual concepts Diane had embraced after Alex's death. He believed in tangible things, in problems that could be solved with enough thought and resources. But as he turned onto his street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed today, that perhaps there were kinds of healing he hadn't yet considered, connections he hadn't allowed himself to make. For the first time in 5 years, Robert left the cemetery feeling something other than emptiness. He wasn't sure what to call this new feeling. It wasn't hope exactly. Maybe just a question, a small opening where before there had only been certainty in his grief. And for now, that was enough. A week had passed since Robert's last visit to the cemetery. The conversation with Diane hadn't gone as he'd hoped. She hadn't been home that evening, and when he called, she explained she was at a fundraiser for the children's hospital. Robert had thought about joining her but ended up working from home instead. Some habits were hard to break. Now, as he drove through the cemetery gates again, Robert found himself scanning the grounds, wondering if the boy would be there, He'd brought the usual hydrangeas for Alex, but this time he'd also stopped for coffee on the way, something he rarely did anymore. The cup warmed his hand as he walked the familiar path. To his surprise, the boy was there, sitting cross-legged, in front of his mother's grave just as he had been last week. Robert slowed his pace, suddenly unsure. He'd thought about this moment but hadn't actually decided what he might say if the boy was here again. Robert approached Alex's grave first, setting down his coffee to arrange the flowers. As he worked, he glanced over at the boy. This time, he could see him more clearly. Dark blonde hair that needed a trim fell across his forehead. His clothes were clean but well worn, jeans with a patch on one knee and a faded green hoodie despite the mild weather. The boy was talking quietly to the headstone, his hands moving as he spoke. Robert recognized the gesture. It was something he did himself when deep in thought, talking with his hands, a habit Alex had picked up from him. After a moment's hesitation, Robert picked up his coffee and walked the short distance to where the boy sat. "Hello," he said, keeping his voice gentle. The boy looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he composed himself. "Hi," he answered, his voice cracking slightly. "I noticed you here last week," Robert said. "I'm Robert, I visit my son." He gestured toward Alex's grave. The boy nodded. "I'm Jamie. I visit my mom." His eyes were a striking blue-green, serious beyond his years. "Do you come here often?" Robert asked, immediately feeling foolish at how the question sounded like a bad pickup line. But Jamie didn't seem to notice. "Every Thursday after school, my grandma drops me off on her way to work the evening shift, then picks me up after." Robert nodded, understanding the routine. "I come on the 15th of every month, has been 5 years now." A moment of awkward silence fell between them. Robert wasn't used to talking to children anymore. Before Alex died, he'd been comfortable with his son's friends, coaching Little League, hosting sleepovers. After, he'd avoided situations with children whenever possible. "Your flowers are nice," Jamie said, looking at the hydrangeas in Robert's hand. "Mom liked sunflowers best." He pointed to a small, slightly wilted sunflower propped against his mother's headstone. "Alex, my son, he liked these blue ones," Robert said. "We had them in our garden. He used to help his mom take care of them." Jamie nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry about your son," he said, the words clearly practiced but sincere nonetheless. Robert wondered how many condolences this young boy had both received and given in his short life. "I'm sorry about your mom," Robert replied, and meant it. Jamie shrugged in that way children do when trying to act tougher than they feel. "It's been 3 years, I still miss her a lot, but Grandma says it gets easier with time." He looked at Robert with curious eyes. "Has it gotten easier for you?" The directness of the question caught Robert off guard. In his world of corporate diplomacy, people rarely ask such straightforward questions about painful subjects. He found himself answering honestly. "Some days are better than others. The sharp pain dulls over time, but it never really goes away completely." He paused, then added, "Your grandmother is right, though. It does get easier to carry." Jamie seemed to consider this. "Yeah, that makes sense. Like how my backpack felt. Super heavy at the start of school, but now I hardly notice it." Robert smiled at the comparison. "That's a good way of putting it." Jamie glanced at his watch, a chunky plastic thing with some cartoon character Robert didn't recognize. "I've got about 40 minutes before Grandma comes back. I usually just talk to Mom about school and stuff." "Don't let me interrupt," Robert said, taking a step back. "It's okay," Jamie said. "Mom would like that I'm being polite to someone else. Who's sad?" He hesitated, then asked, "What kind of stuff do you tell your son when you visit?" Robert took a sip of his cooling coffee. "Work projects mostly. Books I've read. Small things from day to day." "What did he like to do? Before, I mean." "He loved science, building things, taking them apart to see how they worked." Robert smiled at the memory. "He once disassembled our microwave. His mother was not happy about that." Jamie grinned. "Did he get it back together?" "Mostly. It never quite worked the same after that, but we kept it anyway." I like science too, Jamie said. I'm doing a project for the school fair about solar energy. Made a little car that runs on a solar panel. Something tightened in Robert's chest. Alex did a similar project when he was about your age. His used wind energy, though. A little windmill-powered car. That's cool. Wind is harder to work with than solar. Did he win? Second place, Robert said. He was pretty disappointed. He always wanted to come in first. Me too, Jamie admitted. Last year I did a project on water filtration and only got honorable mention. This year I'm aiming higher. Robert found himself genuinely interested. What's your design like? Jamie's face lit up and he launched into an explanation of his solar car, complete with the challenges of gear ratios and friction reduction. His enthusiasm was infectious, his knowledge impressive for his age. As he talked, Robert realized this was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone in months that wasn't about work. You know a lot about this, Robert said when Jamie paused for breath. Jamie shrugged. I read a lot. The library has good books on this stuff, and there are some videos online, but Grandma's internet is pretty slow, so books are usually better. Robert nodded, making a mental note. Your grandmother, she raises you? Yeah, since Mom died. She works a lot, but she's nice. She makes the best pancakes on weekends. Jamie's face grew serious again. Money's kinda tight, though. I try not to ask for too much for science stuff. Before Robert could respond, Jamie changed the subject. What about Alex's mom? Does she come here too? Not as often anymore, Robert said, the words feeling stiff. We handle grief differently. Jamie seemed to understand that some topics needed gentle handling. Grandma doesn't come much either. She says she can talk to Mom from anywhere, doesn't need to be here specifically. That's a nice thought, Robert said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Robert finished his coffee, crumpling the cup in his hand. I should let you have your time with your mom, he said finally. It was nice meeting you, Jamie. You too, Jamie said. Then, will you be here next Thursday? I mean, if that's not your regular day, I understand. The question took Robert by surprise, as did his answer. I could be. Jamie nodded, seeming pleased. Cool. Maybe I could show you pictures of my solar car, if you want. I'd like that, Robert said, and realized he meant it. As he walked back to Alex's grave, Robert felt lighter somehow. He sat on his bench and began his usual ritual of sharing the past week with Alex. But this time his stories included something new. His conversation with Jamie, the boys' science project, the unexpected connection he'd felt. When it was time to leave, Robert found himself looking forward to next Thursday in a way he hadn't anticipated anything in years. On the drive home, he made a detour to a bookstore, something he hadn't done since Alex died. The young clerk looked surprised when Robert asked for recommendations on the latest books about solar energy for kids, but helpfully pointed him toward a section with colorful covers and promising titles. Robert selected 3 books, hesitated, then added a 4th about advanced science projects for middle schoolers. At the register, he spotted a display of small solar-powered building kits and added one to his purchases. As the clerk rang up his items, she commented, Your son will love these. Robert started to correct her, then stopped. I hope so, he said instead. That night, Robert called Diane. When she answered, sounding surprised to hear from him, he asked if she'd be home for dinner tomorrow. There was a pause before she said, Yes, good, Robert said. I'd like to talk about some changes I'm thinking about making. After they hung up, Robert sat in his home office, the bag of books and the solar kit on the desk in front of him. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing or why. All he knew was that for the first time in 5 years, he was thinking about next week, next month, a future that felt like more than just going through the motions. He opened one of the books and began to read, wanting to understand what had sparked such enthusiasm in Jamie's eyes when he talked about his project. Somewhere in that enthusiasm, Robert had glimpsed something he'd thought was lost forever, a reason to engage with the world again. 3 weeks had passed since Robert first spoke with Jamie, and Thursday cemetery visits had become a fixed part of his schedule. He found himself looking forward to these meetings in a way that surprised him. Anticipation was an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. His dinner with Diane had gone better than expected. They'd talked more openly than they had in months, maybe years. Robert had told her about Jamie, about the boys' science project, and the strange comfort he found in their conversations. "It sounds good for you," Diane had said, her eyes studying his face with a thoughtfulness he'd almost forgotten. "You seem more present." Robert couldn't disagree. Something had shifted in him, a slight turning toward life rather than away from it. Today, as Robert walked through the cemetery, he carried not only the usual blue hydrangeas for Alex, but also a gift bag containing the solar kit and books he'd bought. He felt oddly nervous, like he was overstepping some boundary. But Jamie had mentioned money was tight, and Robert had more than he could ever spend. Why not help with something that clearly brought the boy joy? Jamie was already there, sitting by his mother's grave. When he saw Robert, he waved, a gesture that seemed more enthusiastic than their somber surroundings typically encouraged. "I brought my project photos," Jamie called as Robert approached. He held up a battered tablet with a cracked screen protector. "Let me put these down first," Robert said, gesturing with the flowers. After placing them at Alex's grave, he joined Jamie, who was swiping through photos of what looked like a shoebox-sized car with a small solar panel mounted on top. "This is version 3, Jamie explained. "The first 2 had problems with the wheels, too much friction." His finger traced the design on the screen. "See how I changed the axle setup? That made it way faster." Robert nodded, genuinely impressed. "Smart solution. What materials did you use?" "Mostly stuff from the recycling bin and a kit my science teacher let me borrow. The solar panel was the hard part to find. My grandma got it from a friend whose kid used to be into this stuff but gave up." Robert listened as Jamie walked him through the entire building process, pointing out challenges and solutions. The boys' creativity with limited resources reminded him painfully of Alex, who had always been able to create something from nothing. When Jamie finished his explanation, Robert handed him the gift bag. "I got you something that might help with your next project." Jamie's eyes widened. He hesitated, then took the bag. "You didn't have to get me anything." "I wanted to," Robert said simply. Jamie carefully removed the tissue paper and pulled out the books first, his expression brightening with each title. "These are awesome. I've been wanting to read this one forever." He held up a book about renewable energy. Then he discovered the solar kit at the bottom of the bag. His mouth actually dropped open. "Whoa, this is the advanced one. It can build like 15 different things." The boy's joy was so pure, so unguarded, that Robert felt a lump form in his throat. When was the last time he'd made someone this happy? "Thank you," Jamie said, his voice suddenly serious. This is really nice of you." "You're welcome," Robert replied. "I thought about what you said about the library books, and I figured these might be helpful." Jamie carefully returned everything to the bag, handling the items as if they were made of glass. "I can't wait to show Grandma." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Jamie spoke again. "I've been thinking about what to do after the science fair. I've got this idea for a water purification system that uses solar power. Do you think that could work?" "It definitely could," Robert said. "There are companies working on similar technology on a larger scale." "Like your company?" Jamie asked. Robert had mentioned he ran a tech company but hadn't gone into details. "Not exactly. My company focuses more on software than hardware. But the principles are similar, solving problems with technology." Jamie nodded thoughtfully. "My mom used to say that smart people should use their smarts to help others." He looked down at his hands. "She was really big on helping people." "She sounds like she was a wonderful person," Robert said gently. "She was. She worked at a hospital, not as a doctor or nurse, but helping with the paperwork stuff. She said it was her way of being part of something important." Jamie picked at a loose thread on his jeans. "She was driving home from work when it happened." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. When what happened? The accident, Jamie said, his voice smaller now. A bad car crash. She was hurt pretty bad. She lived for a while after, but the doctor said the injuries were too much. Something cold settled in Robert's stomach. Car accident. Hospital. The timing, 3 years ago. He tried to keep his voice steady. That must have been very hard for you. Jamie shrugged in that way children do when trying to seem braver than they feel. Yeah, I miss her a lot, especially when good stuff happens, you know? Like when I got an A on my big math test last month, I really wanted to tell her. Robert nodded, but his mind was racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the coincidence felt too great to ignore. Jamie, he said carefully, do you know where the accident happened? On Miller's Bridge, Jamie replied. The big one over the river. Grandma says a truck hit Mom's car. She doesn't talk about it much. Robert felt like he couldn't breathe. Miller's Bridge. The same bridge where Alex had died. The night was etched permanently in his memory. The phone call, the rush to the hospital, the horrible waiting, and then the news that had shattered their lives. 2 cars had been involved. Alex had been driving home from a friend's house, his first year with a license. The other driver, a woman, had survived initially but was critically injured. Robert had never followed up on what happened to her. In his grief, nothing else had mattered. Are you okay? Jamie was looking at him with concern. You look kind of sick. Robert forced himself to take a deep breath. I'm fine. Just remembered something. He glanced at his watch, desperate for an excuse to leave. I should get going. Meeting at work. Jamie's face fell slightly, but he nodded. Okay, thanks again for the books and stuff. They're really great. You're welcome, Robert said automatically. See you next week? Yeah. Jamie carefully tucked the gift bag under his arm and gave a small wave as Robert walked away. Back in his car, Robert sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It couldn't be coincidence. Jamie's mother, Lisa Marie Taylor, according to her headstone, had to be the other driver in the accident that killed Alex. And now, by some twisted joke of fate, Robert had befriended her son. He pulled out his phone and did what he should have done weeks ago. He searched for information about the accident. It took only minutes to confirm what he already knew in his gut. Lisa Taylor, 35, had been the other driver. She had survived the initial crash but died 3 months later from complications related to her injuries. The article mentioned she left, behind a young son. Robert closed the browser and started his car with shaking hands. What was he supposed to do with this information? How could he face Jamie next week, or ever again? As he drove away from the cemetery, memories of the accident, investigation flooded back. The police report had indicated that road conditions were poor that night. Heavy rain had made the bridge slick. Both drivers had been going too fast for the conditions, but neither had been under the influence or texting. Just a tragic accident, they'd said. No one to blame, but Robert had blamed the other driver anyway, silently, bitterly. It had been easier than facing the possibility that Alex might have been partly responsible, or that sometimes terrible things simply happened without reason. By the time Robert reached his office, he'd made a decision. He needed to know more about Lisa Taylor and the accident. Not just for his own peace of mind, but because he owed it to Jamie to understand who his mother had been. His assistant looked surprised when Robert canceled his meetings for the afternoon. Personal matter, he explained curtly, something he'd never used as an excuse before. Alone in his office, Robert made calls and sent emails to people who owed him favors. A lawyer friend, a contact at the police department, even a board member, at the hospital where Lisa had worked. By evening, he had compiled a file of information about Lisa Marie Taylor, single mother, dedicated hospital administrative assistant who often worked overtime, volunteer at a food bank on weekends. Her supervisor at the hospital described her as the kind of person who held everything together. After the accident, her co-workers had taken up a collection to help with her medical bills. Robert stared at the photo he'd found from the hospital newsletter. A smiling woman with Jamie's blue-green eyes and the same serious expression he sometimes wore. The caption identified her as part of a team being recognized for improving the hospital's billing system to help low-income patients. The last page in Robert's makeshift file was the hardest to look at, a copy of the complete accident report. It laid out the facts in clinical detail. Time of accident, 9:17 p.m. Weather conditions, heavy rain. Alex had been driving northbound, Lisa southbound. Alex's car had crossed the center line slightly, possibly hydroplaning. Lisa had swerved to avoid him. Both cars had collided with the bridge guardrail. Alex had died at the scene. Robert closed the file and put his head in his hands. For 5 years he'd carried anger toward a faceless stranger who had survived when his son hadn't. Now that stranger had a name, a face, a story, and a son who loved science projects just like Alex had. When Robert finally drove home that night, the file sat on the passenger seat where he usually placed Alex's flowers. He needed to tell Diane what he'd discovered. He needed her perspective, her inherent compassion that he'd always lacked. As he pulled into their driveway, he noticed something unusual. Diane's car was already there, and lights glowed warmly from the windows of their home. She was rarely home before him these days. Robert sat in his car for a long moment, gathering his courage. He didn't know what he was going to do about Jamie yet, but he knew he couldn't face this newest twist of grief alone. Robert sat in his car for several minutes, staring at the warm glow from his house windows. Finally, with a deep breath, he gathered the file about Lisa Taylor and walked to the front door. Inside, he found Diane in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The scene was so unexpectedly domestic that Robert paused in the doorway. They hadn't shared a home-cooked meal in months, maybe longer. "You're cooking," he said, stating the obvious. Diane looked up, a small smile on her face. "I thought it might be nice, it's been a while." She studied his expression. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." In many ways, he had. Robert placed the file on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair at the table. "I found out something today about Jamie." Diane wiped her hands on a dish towel and joined him at the table. "The boy from the cemetery?" Robert nodded, then opened the file and pushed it toward her. His mother was the other driver, in Alex's accident. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes widening as she processed the information. "I couldn't believe it either," Robert said. "But I checked, double-checked. It's her." Diane flipped through the papers, pausing at Lisa Taylor's photo. "The poor woman," she murmured. Then, looking up at Robert, "The poor boy. Does he know? About Alex, I mean?" "I don't think so," Robert said. "He knows his mother died from injuries in a car accident, but he's never mentioned anything about the other driver. I don't think his grandmother has told him." Diane was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from the file to Robert's face. "What are you going to do?" It was the question he'd been asking himself all afternoon. "I don't know. Part of me wants to never go back to the cemetery on Thursdays, to avoid him completely." "And the other part?" Diane asked softly. Robert ran, his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he'd been making since college. "The other part knows that's not fair to Jamie. He's just a kid who lost his mother. None of this is his fault." Diane reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the first time she'd touched him with such tenderness in years. "You've grown fond of him." "I have," Robert admitted. "He reminds me of Alex sometimes. His enthusiasm for science, the way his whole face lights up when he talks about his projects." He shook his head. "But now, knowing who he is, it feels complicated." "Life often is," Diane said. She withdrew her hand and closed the file. "For what it's worth, I think you should continue seeing him." Robert looked at her in surprise. "Really? You don't think it's wrong somehow?" "Why would it be wrong? Two people who've experienced a similar loss finding comfort in each other's company. There's something beautiful in that." Diane's eyes grew distant. Maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it's what both of you needed. I don't believe in that kind of thing, Robert said automatically. I know you don't, Diane replied. But consider this. Out of all the graves in that cemetery, you two found each other. The statistical probability must be tiny. Robert couldn't argue with that. The coincidence was almost impossible. There's something else, he said after a moment. Jamie mentioned his grandmother is having health problems. He didn't give details, but he seemed worried. All the more reason not to disappear from his life right now, Diane said firmly. Then more gently, I'd like to meet him. Robert blinked in surprise. You would? Yes, Diane said, standing up to return to her cooking. From everything you've told me, he sounds like a special boy. And she hesitated. I think it might help me too. To meet someone connected to that night, but in a positive way. They ate dinner together that evening, talking more openly than they had in years. Diane shared stories about her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, and Robert told her more about his conversations with Jamie. For the first time since Alex's death, they reminisced about their son without the conversation ending in painful silence. When Thursday came around, Robert found himself parked at the cemetery, still undecided. The file about Lisa Taylor sat on the passenger seat next to Alex's flowers. After a long moment, he picked up both and walked the familiar path. Jamie wasn't at his mother's grave. Robert felt a complicated mix of relief and disappointment as he placed his flowers at Alex's headstone. Perhaps this was for the best, a natural end to a connection that had become too complicated. He was about to leave when he spotted a familiar figure hurrying down the path, Jamie, looking out of breath. Sorry I'm late, the boy called. Grandma had a doctor's appointment. I wasn't sure you'd still be here. I was just about to leave, Robert admitted. Oh, Jamie said, his face falling. That's okay, I understand. Robert hesitated, then gestured to the bench by Alex's grave. But I can stay a while longer. Jamie's smile returned as he joined Robert on the bench. Thanks. I was hoping to tell you something. He took a deep breath. I won first place at the science fair with my solar car. That's fantastic, Robert said, genuinely pleased for the boy. Congratulations. My teacher said it was the most professional project in the whole fair, Jamie continued, pride evident in his voice. She wants me to enter the regional competition next month. You definitely should, Robert encouraged. Your design was excellent. The books you gave me helped a lot, Jamie said. I added some ideas from them to improve the efficiency. His expression grew more serious. But I'm worried about the regional fair. It's in Westbrook, and Grandma, she hasn't been feeling great lately. Robert nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. Is she ill? She has heart problems, Jamie explained, looking down at his hands. Nothing super serious yet, but the doctor wants her to rest more, which is funny because she says she can't afford to rest. He kicked at a pebble on the ground. I heard her talking on the phone about medical bills. She didn't know I was listening. Robert thought of the file in his hand, of Lisa Taylor's struggle with medical bills after her accident. Now her mother was facing the same challenge while trying to raise her grandson. The regional fair, Robert said carefully. When exactly is it? 3 weeks from Saturday, Jamie replied. It's an all-day thing. Grandma says we'll figure something out, but I know she's worried about taking time off work. Robert found himself speaking before he'd fully thought it through. I could take you if your grandmother agrees. Jamie looked up, surprise and hope mingling on his face. Really? You wouldn't mind? Not at all, Robert said. I'd like to see your project in action. That would be amazing, Jamie exclaimed. Then his expression grew uncertain. But would you want to meet my grandma first? She's pretty careful about who I spend time with. Of course, Robert said, though his stomach tightened at the prospect. That would be the responsible thing to do. They arranged for Robert to come to Jamie's home that weekend to meet his grandmother. As Jamie gave him the address, an apartment in a modest part of town, Robert wrestled with whether he should tell the boy the truth about their connection. Not yet, he decided. He needed to meet the grandmother first, to understand what she knew and what she'd told Jamie. When Robert arrived home that evening, he found Diane waiting for him. "How did it go?" she asked. "Jamie won his science fair," Robert said, setting down his keys, "and I apparently volunteered to take him to the regional competition." Diane's eyebrows rose. "That's a big step." "I'm meeting his grandmother this weekend," Robert continued. "Diane, I'd like you to come with me." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Robert said firmly. "If we're going to be involved in Jamie's life in any way, we should do this together, and—" He hesitated. "I might need your help if things get complicated." Diane nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll come." Saturday arrived with a nervous energy Robert hadn't felt in years. He and Diane drove to the address Jamie had given him, a small apartment building on the outskirts of town. The building was older but well-maintained, with flower boxes adorning some of the windows. "What exactly did you tell them about why we're coming?" Diane asked as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Just that I wanted to introduce my wife and discuss the science fair," Robert replied. "I didn't mention the other connection." Diane squeezed his hand. "One step at a time." Jamie answered the door, his face lighting up when he saw them. "You came, and you brought your wife." He turned to call over his shoulder, "Grandma, they're here." An older woman appeared behind Jamie, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had the same blue-green eyes as Jamie and his mother, though lined with age and what Robert recognized as chronic worry. "Mrs. Taylor," Robert said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Keller. This is my wife, Diane." The woman's hand froze halfway to his. A flash of recognition crossed her face, followed by something like fear. She knew exactly who he was. "Please, come in," she said after a moment's pause, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. The apartment was small but immaculately kept. School books and science materials were neatly arranged on the dining table, and framed photos lined the walls, many featuring Lisa Taylor with a younger Jamie. "Jamie, why don't you show Mrs. Keller your science project?" his grandmother suggested, her eyes still fixed on Robert. "It's set up in your room." Jamie nodded eagerly. "Come on, I'll show you how it works," he said to Diane, who followed him down the short hallway. Left alone with Mrs. Taylor, Robert felt the weight of 5 years of grief and unspoken words hanging between them. "You know who I am," he said quietly. She nodded, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. "I recognized your name when Jamie first mentioned you. Robert Keller, the father of the boy who was driving the other car." Her hands trembled slightly. "I never thought we would meet like this." "Neither did I," Robert admitted, taking the seat across from her. "I didn't know who Jamie was when I first met him. Not until he mentioned his mother died after a car accident on Miller's Bridge." "Mrs. Taylor studied his face. "And now that you know?" Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Now I believe that Jamie is a remarkable boy who has suffered a tremendous loss, just like my son was." From down the hall came the sound of Jamie excitedly explaining his project to Diane, and Mrs. Taylor's expression softened slightly. "He talks about you all the time," she said. "The kind man from the cemetery who understands science and gives him books." She paused. "I should have told him who you were, but I didn't know how, without burdening him with more pain." "I understand," Robert said. And strangely, he found that he did. "I haven't told him either. I'm not sure if we should." Mrs. Taylor looked toward the hallway where her grandson's voice continued animatedly. "I've always believed that the truth, painful as it can be, is better than secrets, but the timing matters." She turned back to Robert, her gaze direct. "Why are you here, Mr. Keller? What do you want from my grandson?" The question was fair but difficult to answer. Robert took a deep breath. I'm here because Jamie reminds me that there's still good in the world. Because helping him with his science project has been the first thing that's felt meaningful to me in 5 years. He met her eyes. I'm not here out of guilt or obligation. I'm here because I care about what happens to him. Mrs. Taylor held his gaze for a long moment before she spoke again. My daughter would have liked you, I think. She always believed in second chances. From down the hall, Jamie called. Grandma, Mrs. Keller says my project is amazing. Can she stay for cookies? Mrs. Taylor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. We have a lot to figure out, Mr. Keller, but for now, I think we can manage cookies. As they joined Jamie and Diane in the small bedroom-turned-workshop, Robert felt the weight on his shoulders shift slightly. The pain wasn't gone. It might never be. But something else was growing alongside it. Something that felt against all odds, a little like hope. 3 weeks had passed since the afternoon of cookies and science projects in Jamie's small apartment. In that time, something remarkable had happened. The careful beginnings of a bridge between two families broken by the same tragedy. Robert and Diane had returned to the Taylor apartment twice more. The first visit had been to discuss the regional science fair, bringing takeout dinner that they all shared around the small kitchen table. The second had been more serious. Robert had noticed Mrs. Taylor's shortness of breath and the pill bottles carefully arranged on the counter. After some gentle prodding, she'd admitted that her heart condition was worsening, her medical bills mounting. Today was different. Today was the regional science fair, and Robert was picking Jamie up at 7 in the morning for the drive to Westbrook. Do you have everything? Robert asked as Jamie climbed into his car, carefully holding his solar-powered car project in a specially constructed carrying case. Triple-checked, Jamie confirmed, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. Grandma helped me go through the checklist last night. How is she feeling today? Robert asked, pulling away from the apartment building. Better, Jamie said. The new medicine seems to be working. She wanted to come, but the doctor said she should rest. He fiddled with the zipper on his jacket, a new one that Diane had insisted on buying him when she realized he didn't have anything suitable for the chilly convention center. Diane's going to meet us there, Robert said. She's bringing lunch so we don't have to pay those ridiculous convention center prices. Jamie grinned. Your wife is really nice. She reminds me a little of my mom. The comment caught Robert by surprise, but he managed to smile. She is nice. I haven't always appreciated that as much as I should have. The drive to Westbrook passed quickly, with Jamie chattering about his project improvements and the competition he'd researched online. Robert found himself relaxing into the conversation, offering suggestions and encouragement. At the convention center, they found Diane waiting. By the entrance, she gave Jamie a quick hug. Ready to win this thing? Jamie nodded, though Robert could see his confidence wavering slightly as he looked at the large building. There are going to be way more kids here than at school. And not one of them has worked as hard as you have, Robert assured him, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. Inside, the convention center bustled with activity. Hundreds of display tables were arranged in long rows, each featuring a different science project. Students from ages 10 to 18 moved about with their parents and teachers, setting up demonstrations and making last-minute adjustments. Jamie's eyes widened. Whoa, he breathed. This is huge. Robert checked the registration information. You're in the junior division, table 47. Let's go find it. As they made their way through the crowd, Robert noticed Jamie beginning to shrink into himself, intimidated by the scale of the event and the professional-looking displays around them. When they found table 47, Jamie set down his case but made no move to open it. What's wrong? Diane asked gently. Jamie bit his lip. Some of these other projects look really fancy. My car is just made from recycled stuff, and the kit Mr. Robert gave me. That's what makes it special, Robert said firmly. Anyone can make something with expensive materials. It takes real talent to create something remarkable with limited resources. Jamie didn't look convinced, but he began unpacking his project. Robert and Diane helped him arrange the display, adding the poster boards he'd created explaining the solar technology and the efficiency improvements he'd designed. "I'll be right back," Robert said suddenly, excusing himself. He returned 15 minutes later with 3 cups of hot chocolate and a small bag. "For nerves," he explained, handing Jamie a cup. From the bag he pulled a small pin in the shape of a gear. "And this is for luck. Alex wore it during his science fair. I thought you might want to borrow it today." Jamie's eyes widened as he accepted the pin. "Are you sure? This was your son's." "I'm sure," Robert said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. He would have wanted another young scientist to have it today. Jamie carefully pinned it to his shirt, handling it with reverence. "Thank you. I'll take really good care of it." As the judges began making their rounds, Robert and Diane stepped back to give Jamie space, watching from a distance as he demonstrated his solar car to the first judge, a woman in a lab coat, who nodded appreciatively as the little vehicle zoomed across the table. "You gave him Alex's pin?" Diane said quietly. Robert nodded. It felt right. Diane slipped her hand into his. It was right. Throughout the day, they watched as Jamie explained his project to judge after judge. With each presentation, the boy grew more confident, his initial nervousness replaced by genuine enthusiasm. By the final judging round, Jamie was animatedly discussing the potential applications of solar technology with a gray-haired man who kept nodding and asking follow-up questions. "He's a natural," Diane observed. "He is," Robert agreed. He checked his watch. "They'll announce the winners soon." The award ceremony was held in a small auditorium adjacent to the exhibition hall. Robert and Diane sat with Jamie, who couldn't stop fidgeting with excitement and nerves. "Even if I don't win anything, this was still the best day," Jamie whispered to Robert as the Junior Division Awards began. Robert smiled. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Your mom would be too." The honorable mentions and third-place winners were announced, and Jamie's name wasn't called. He squeezed Robert's hand tightly as the second-place winner was revealed. Still not him. "First place in the Junior Division Solar Energy category," the announcer said, "goes to Jamie Taylor for his high-efficiency recycled materials solar car." Jamie sat frozen in shock until Diane nudged him. "That's you. Go on up." The boy made his way to the stage, accepting his trophy and certificate with a stunned expression. Robert felt his chest tighten with a complicated mix of pride, joy, and a bittersweet awareness that he'd once imagined watching Alex in a similar moment. On the drive home, Jamie couldn't stop talking about the feedback from the judges and the university scholarship program that had given him their card. "They said I should apply when I'm in high school," he explained, still clutching his trophy. "They help kids who want to study engineering or environmental science." "That's wonderful," Diane said. "You've got a bright future ahead of you." As they approached Jamie's apartment building, Robert noticed an ambulance parked outside. Jamie spotted it at the same moment. "Grandma!" he cried, his celebration forgotten in an instant. Robert parked hurriedly, and they all rushed up to the apartment. Inside, they found paramedics helping Mrs. Taylor onto a stretcher. "I'm fine," she was insisting, though her face was pale and drawn. "Just a little episode." "Grandma." Jamie pushed through to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" "Just got a little dizzy, sweetheart," Mrs. Taylor said, attempting a reassuring smile. "Nothing to worry about." Her eyes found Robert and Diane standing in the doorway. "How did he do?" "First place," Robert said. "He was brilliant." Pride momentarily overshadowed the pain on Mrs. Taylor's face. "Of course he was." One of the paramedics stepped forward. "We need to take her in for observation. Her heart rhythm is irregular." "I'm coming with you," Jamie said immediately, panic clear in his voice. "The ambulance can only take one family member, son," the paramedic explained gently. "We'll bring Jamie to the hospital," Robert said without hesitation. "Which one are you taking her to?" "Memorial," the paramedic replied. As they loaded Mrs. Taylor into the ambulance, Jamie stood watching, his trophy forgotten on the apartment floor. Diane picked it up and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. "She'll be okay," she told Jamie, though none of them could be sure. At the hospital, They found Mrs. Taylor already settled in a room, hooked up to monitors and an IV. Her doctor, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, spoke with them in the hallway. Her condition has worsened, the doctor explained. She needs a procedure, not major surgery, but necessary to regulate her heart rhythm. The problem is, she hesitated, glancing at Jamie. The problem is insurance. Robert finished for her. What doesn't it cover? The doctor looked relieved at his understanding. There's a significant out-of-pocket cost and then the recovery period and medication. I'll cover it, Robert said without hesitation. All of it, and whatever else she needs. Back in Mrs. Taylor's room, with Jamie sitting beside his grandmother's bed, Robert and Diane explained what they'd discussed with the doctor. I can't accept that, Mrs. Taylor protested weakly. It's too much. Please, Robert said. Let me do this. Mrs. Taylor studied his face for a long moment. We need to talk, she said finally, glancing meaningfully at Jamie. About everything. Robert nodded, understanding her meaning. It was time for the truth. The next morning, after Mrs. Taylor's procedure had been successfully completed, they gathered in her hospital room. Jamie sat between Robert and Diane on one side of the bed, confused by the serious atmosphere. Jamie, Mrs. Taylor began gently. There's something we need to tell you. Something I should have told you before. Over the next half hour, with gentle words and many pauses, Mrs. Taylor explained to Jamie the full story of his mother's accident, and who Robert and Diane were. Robert watched the boy's face change as understanding dawned, his expression cycling through confusion, shock, and a deep sadness. So, your son was... Jamie couldn't finish the sentence. Robert nodded. Yes, Alex was driving the other car that night. Jamie looked down at his hands, processing this revelation. Is that why you started talking to me? Because of the accident? No, Robert said firmly. I started talking to you because you reminded me that there was still good in the world. I didn't know who you were until later. But you kept coming back even after you knew, Jamie said, his voice small. Because by then, I knew you, Robert explained. Not as Lisa Taylor's son, but as Jamie, the brilliant young scientist who loved solar power and talked to his mom at the cemetery. Jamie was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to feel about this, he admitted finally. That's okay, Diane said gently. You don't have to figure it out all at once. There's something else we want to talk about, Robert said, glancing at Mrs. Taylor, who nodded her encouragement. We've been discussing this with your grandmother. After she gets out of the hospital, she's going to need time to recover. Jamie's face clouded with worry. But who will take care of her? And me? That's what we want to discuss, Robert continued carefully. We'd like to help. In fact, we'd like to offer you both a place to stay while your grandmother recovers. You mean, live with you? Jamie asked, his eyebrows rising in surprise. If you're comfortable with that, Diane said. We have plenty of space, and if not, we can figure out another arrangement. Jamie looked to his grandmother. What do you think, Grandma? Mrs. Taylor reached for his hand. I think it's a good idea, sweetheart, just until I'm back on my feet. And maybe... She hesitated. Maybe this is how we all start to heal. 1 year later, Robert stood at Alex's grave, arranging the usual blue hydrangeas. But this time, he wasn't alone. Jamie stood beside him, placing a small solar-powered pinwheel next to the flowers. Do you think he would have liked it? Jamie asked, watching the colorful wheel begin to spin in the sunlight. He would have loved it, Robert assured him. Especially knowing you designed it yourself. Behind them, Diane and Mrs. Taylor waited on a nearby bench. The past year had brought changes none of them could have imagined. Mrs. Taylor's health improving under proper care, Jamie's science scholarship to a prestigious private school, and most surprisingly, the gradual blending of their lives. Mrs. Taylor had recovered enough to return to her apartment, but she and Jamie spent weekends and many dinners with Robert and Diane. The arrangement had evolved naturally, filling empty spaces in all their lives. Ready to go? Diane called. "We'll be late for Jamie's presentation." Today, Jamie would be demonstrating his newest invention at a youth innovation conference. A solar-powered water purification system inspired by his original science fair project, but far more sophisticated. "Coming," Robert replied. He placed his hand briefly on Alex's headstone. "See you next month, son." As they walked away from the grave, Jamie slipped his hand into Robert's, a gesture that had once seemed impossible, but now felt natural. "You know what I was thinking?" Jamie said as they reached the car. "What's that?" Robert asked. "Maybe someday we could start a foundation for kids who like science but don't have the money for college. We could name it after both of them, Alex and my mom." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think that's a wonderful idea." As they drove away from the cemetery, Robert glanced in the rearview mirror at the place where two graves had brought four broken people together. Where a chance encounter had opened the door to healing none of them had thought possible. Life would never be what it was before the accident. The losses they'd suffered could never be undone. But in finding each other, they'd discovered that even the deepest wounds could become the foundation for something new, not a replacement for what was lost, but a testament to the resilience of the human heart.